Hello, this is John from caveofprogramming.com, and in this tutorial we're going to look at the event listener pattern. And this isn't really Android specific, but I'm going to go through it here pretty quickly, just because it's something that I want to use to simplify the architecture of my application a bit. And this is something that people who haven't seen it before tend to find very confusing, because it is quite confusing, but it does help simplify your architecture in GUI kind of programs tremendously. And if you get lost in the following tutorial at all, then I'd suggest just following it yourself and typing out something that's as kind of equivalent to what I'm typing, something similar, and gradually you'll see how it comes together. But on the other hand, if you already know it, or if you don't want to know it, then you could happily skip this tutorial. Now the point of this is that I've got this touch listener that's listening to my image and it's finding out which points the user touches on the screen. And when I've collected 4 points, I want something to happen, and that something could either be that I add the 4 points to the database and that I'm going to create shortly, or I could check those 4 points to see if they're close to the points in the database. And either way, at this point in the touch listener code, I kind of need some code that that does something with the database, and which therefore may take a little while to return. And I kind of just don't like situations where I've got a class here, and I've got an anonymous class within that class, and here what I will be doing is calling another method from the outer class when I've collected 4 points, and it kind of just feels a bit messy to me, and I want to handle it architecturally just a little bit different. So very briefly, what I could do is I could have an array list, add these points to the array list one by one, and then here check the size of the array list, and if it's equal to 4, call the code that does stuff with the database. That would be the simplest way to do it, but to my mind, an inelegant way, and I prefer the way that I'm about to show you now. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take this touch listener code and put it in its own class. So I'll just do Control X on this method, this onTouch method of the touch listener, and cut it. And I'll create a new class here, so in the same package, and I'm going to call it point collector, and I'm going to say that the point collector class implements on touch listener, and I'm going to paste in the method there that I had before, and I'll just do Control Shift O to add the necessary imports for the log file there. So now in my image activity, what I could do is I could give it a private instance variable of the type point collector, the class I just created. I'll call it point collector, and I'll set that equal to a new point collector. And now when I set my touch listener here, I can just pass in my point collector object, and that should run exactly as it did before. And I'll just run this while I'm talking so we can have a look at it in a while. So all I've really done is taken this stuff that responds to touches and put it in its own class. And now in this point collector class, I'm going to give it a private list of points, and I'm going to use the Android point class, and I'll call this points and set it equal to a new array list of point objects. And the Android point class is a simple class that just stores 2D points with integer coordinates. Let's just take a look at my application. I'll go to DDMS and look at the emulator, and I'm just going to click a few points. You can see that the points are still coming out, so it's still working, which is always good to know. So I'll go back to Java here, and now I'm going to add the points to an array list, and in fact I'll change this to int and I'll use math.round, although that is arguably slightly overkill to round these points when I could just cast them to integers. But I'll use math.round to get the integer pixel coordinates here, and for my debug output I'll change this from a 2 decimal place floating point to a integer value with %d, which stands for decimal, I think. And now I'm gonna add, I'm gonna say points.add, and every time we get a point, because the users touch the screen, I'm going to say new point xy and add it to the list there. And then I'll say if points.size is equal to 4, then I've collected 4 points, and I want to tell my image activity class that it's time to check those with the database or add them to the database. Now I'm going to add a, I don't want to refer to image activity directly in here because it's bad practice to have a situation where, in this case, image activity refers to point collector and point collector would then refer to image activity. The two classes would have to know about each other in a sort of circle, and that's a bit of a rat's nest and it's bad practice. So what I'm going to do is, to avoid having to have a reference to my image activity in this class so that I can call some method of it, I'm going to create an interface here. I'm going to go to new interface and I'm going to call this point collection listener, or maybe point collector listener. Actually, I think that'll do the trick. And I'm going to give this one method which just accepts, I'll call it points collected, and that accepts a list of Android point objects like this. Let's add the import for list there, Java util list, and then in my point collector class I'm going to give this a private instance variable of that interface type that I just defined, point collector listener. I'll just call this listener, and in here, when I've collected 4 points, I'll say if listener is not equal to null, then I'll say listener and I'll call its method, its points collected method, and pass in the points like this. And now the final step here is I'm going to go to my image activity and I'm going to make it implements the point collector listener interface. And let's add the method here that we need, add unimplemented methods. I think Eclipse is perhaps being weird. Oh, but it has added the method, so I think we're good. And let's have some debug output here. Let's say log.d and debug tag, actually main activity.debug tag. So that's a JWP string, which is my initials that I defined earlier. And let's just output here collected points, and I'll just say here plus points dot size, so that we can see the size of the array list, which should be 4. And now, if I go back to point collector here, and if I right click in this class, go to source, generate getters and setters, and for listener I can add a set listener method, click OK, and that will set my listener instance variable to whatever object I pass in, and that object must implement the point collector interface. So I go to image activity here, and now I say point collector dot set listener this, and now everything should be working. And I appreciate that if this is the first time you've seen this, and it is really a useful and important thing to know, but it will seem pretty complex, and I can just recommend going through this code, looking at the different bits of it and typing it out yourself a few times. And if you still find yourself stuck after that, you're probably missing some bit of information about how Java references work, or how interfaces work, or something like that. And I could point you in the direction of caveofprogramming.com, where you can find lots of tutorials on Java, and they may enlighten you if you look at interface stuff and that kind of thing. But what we're doing is we're saying that the image activity implements a point collector interface. The point collector interface just has this one method, points collected. Therefore, image activity has a points collected method. And we're saying to this touch listener, we're saying that I'm going to set the, where are we? Set listener. Actually, I've added this in completely stupid place. Let's get rid of it from there, because I want to add it in the onCreate method up here. We're saying on the point collector touch listener, we're calling set listener and passing in image activity, and we can do that because image activity implements point collector listener, and this set listener method expects a point collector listener. Now the point collector listener, the point collector class here has this method set listener. So this listener, the image activity will call this method and pass itself to here, and then we'll take the reference to the image activity and store it in this.listener, so it's stored up here. And then finally, when we've collected 4 points, we will call the points collected method of image activity, which is going to be down here. And the point of this rigmarole is to make sure that the classes are not tightly coupled. So point collector, even though it's calling methods in image activity, it knows nothing about the image activity class. All it knows is that there's some class here which is going to be passed in, which implements a point collector listener interface. So as I say, it's pretty complex when you first see it, and I think there's no substitute for going through it a few times slowly yourself and typing it out and trying to get it to work. But I'm going to leave this for now, and I'm just going to check that it works. Let's just run this, and what we should see is that when we collect 4 points, that we call the method in my image view class, which will output some debug information. And what I'll also do after that is I'll also say points.clear, and I may remove that later because I'm still thinking about the best way to do this, but I think that once I've collected the points and something has been done with them, then we can clear the list of points and start collecting again. Now let's take a look at the emulator here, and let's take a look at DDMS. And so now, well, let's clear all this output and make sure I'm just looking at the stuff with the JWP debug tag here, my initials, and I'll click on 4 points, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so we collect 4 points, and when we've got 4, it says collected points 4, and the reason for that is that if I go back to Eclipse here and go to the Java perspective, this code is being invoked when 4 points are collected, and that's calling this in image activity, which is outputting this message. So that's possibly the most complex thing we'll look at in this series of tutorials, and if you really don't want to have to learn this at this point, then certainly you could not do this. You could instead just have your OnTouch listener as it was previously with an anonymous class, and put in that code for collecting the points into an array list right in there, and call this method or some other method from in there, and that would also work. I just feel that it's somehow less elegant than this way of doing it. Okay, so that's it for this tutorial, and until next time, happy coding.